My name is Audrey Sterling. I am 30 years old, and my father once told me that the only reason I was ever invited to the family's Thanksgiving dinner was because my mother hated having an uneven number of chairs at the mahogany table. I am a senior partner at one of the most prestigious logistics firms in the tri-state area, a woman who meticulously manages a $12.4 million annual operational budget and oversees the movement of high-value cargo across 3 continents. Yet in the presence of my parents, I am reduced to a shadow, a mere footnote in the dramatic saga of my younger sister, Isabella. The scene currently unfolding in the emergency department of St. Jude's Medical Center in downtown Chicago is a testament to the hierarchy of our family, a hierarchy where I am the expendable servant and Isabella is the dying swan. Move. Our daughter is dying while you are standing there like a decorative statue. Get the chief of surgery now, or I will have your medical license shredded by morning. My mother, Victoria, screamed at a young triage nurse whose name tag read Sarah and who looked as though she had been on her feet for 14 hours straight. My mother's face was a violent, pulsating shade of magenta. Her fingers, adorned with a 4-carat Harry Winston diamond ring worth more than the nurse's annual salary, were trembling with a rage that was half performative and half delusional. My father, Marcus Sterling, stood beside her, his tailored charcoal gray Hugo Boss suit worth $3,000 uncreased despite the chaos of the emergency room, his silence serving as a cold endorsement of my mother's verbal assault. Isabella lay on a gurney, her skin pale against the harsh, flickering fluorescent lights of the trauma bay, complaining of a migraine that she insisted felt like an aneurysm, though her vital signs on the Mindray EPM-12M monitor showed a steady, unremarkable rhythm. I stood exactly 3 feet behind them, holding my mother's Hermes Birkin 30 bag in gold Togo leather, which I had been ordered to carry the moment we rushed from the charity gala at the Drake Hotel. I watched the digital clock on the wall, its red numbers ticking past 11:42 p.m., and realized that in the eyes of the 2 people who brought me into this world, I was not their daughter. I was not a successful executive, and I was not even a human being with my own exhaustion. I was simply a placeholder, a decorative statue, as my mother so cruelly put it to the nurse. This has always been the reality of being a Sterling, where the air you breathe is taxed by your parents' expectations and your worth is measured solely by how much you can facilitate Isabella's comfort. To understand how we arrived at this sterile, white-tiled purgatory, you have to understand the cost of a Sterling education and the price of their silence. My parents spent exactly $450,000 on Isabella's private schooling and her failed attempt at a fashion degree in Milan, while I worked 3 jobs at the University of Chicago, surviving on black coffee and 50-cent ramen, just to ensure I wouldn't have to ask them for a single dime that would inevitably come with 1,000 strings attached. The nurse, Sarah, flinched as my mother's spittle landed on her blue scrubs, but she remained professional, her voice a low, controlled whisper as she explained that the chief of surgery was currently in a 6-hour emergency bypass operation on a 10-year-old boy. My mother didn't care about the 10-year-old boy, she didn't care about the medical protocols of a level 1 trauma center, and she certainly didn't care that her eldest daughter was still wearing her gala heels, her feet aching with a dull, throbbing pain that radiated up her calves. She only cared that Isabella had a headache and that the world wasn't stopping its rotation to acknowledge it. I remember the exact moment I realized I was invisible. It was 5 years ago, during my promotion to junior partner, an achievement that came with a $60,000 raise and a corner office overlooking the Chicago River. I had called my father to tell him the news, and he had interrupted me mid-sentence to ask if I knew why Isabella's 2021 Glacier White Audi A4 was making a clicking sound when she turned the steering wheel. There was no congratulations, no pride, just a demand for a mechanic's recommendation. That is the Sterling way. My successes are expected and therefore ignored, while Isabella's failures are tragedies that require a national day of mourning and the immediate mobilization of all family resources. The air in the hospital smelled of industrial-grade bleach and the metallic tang of blood. a scent that always makes the back of my throat itch. My mother turned her head toward me, her eyes narrow and sharp, like a hawk spotting a field mouse. "Audrey, why are you just standing there? Go find the hospital administrator. I know his wife from the opera board. Tell him Marcus and Victoria Sterling are here and that we are being treated like common street people," she hissed, her voice dripping with a condescending venom that she usually reserved for the domestic staff at their Lake Forest estate. I looked at her, really looked at her, seeing the way her expensive Botox had frozen her forehead in a perpetual state of artificial youth, and for a fleeting second, I considered dropping the $10,000 handbag onto the sticky hospital floor and walking out into the humid Chicago night. But the habit of obedience is a heavy chain, forged over 3 decades of being told that I was the strong one, the one who didn't need help, the one who was supposed to take the hits so Isabella wouldn't have to. I shifted the weight of the Birkin bag, feeling the heavy gold hardware dig into my palm, and felt a familiar, cold numbness settle over my heart. My name is Audrey Sterling, and I am 30 years old, and for the last 10 years, I have been the silent architect of my own life, building a fortress of financial independence and professional respect that my parents can neither understand nor touch. I live in a 2-bedroom condo in the West Loop that I bought for $890,000 with my own sweat and late-night spreadsheets, a home they have never visited because it is 20 minutes too far from the yacht club. As I stood in that emergency room, listening to the rhythmic beep of the machines and my mother's shrill demands, I realized that the $12.4 million I manage every year is a simpler task than managing the bottomless pit of my family's entitlement. Isabella moaned on the gurney, a sound that was far too melodic for someone claiming to be in the throes of a neurological catastrophe, and my father reached out to stroke her hair with a tenderness he had never once shown me, not even when I was 10 years old and had fallen from the oak tree in our backyard, breaking my arm in 2 places. He had told me then to stop crying because I was disturbing his conference call with the board of directors. Now, he was whispering to Isabella that everything would be all right, that the best doctors in the country were on their way, and that he would make sure someone paid for the delay in her care. The injustice of it wasn't just in the moment, it was in the history, the thousands of small, sharp cuts that had bled me dry over the years. It was the way they forgot my 25th birthday because Isabella had a breakup that same weekend, or the way they insisted I pay for my own wedding, only to spend $50,000 on Isabella's destination birthday party in Tulum 6 months later. I looked at the nurse, Sarah, and saw the exhaustion in her eyes, a reflection of my own internal weariness. We were both just obstacles in the path of Victoria Sterling's will. My mother's magenta face was now turning a bruised shade of purple as she grabbed a stack of patient files from the counter and slammed them down, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the crowded waiting area. I felt the shift then, a tectonic movement in my soul where the desire to belong was finally crushed by the weight of reality. I was the chief surgeon of my own life, and it was time I stopped letting these people bleed me for their own amusement. The cost of their love was too high, a debt that could never be repaid because the interest rates were set by their own bottomless narcissism. I stood there, the decorative statue they had created. But inside, I was already calculating the logistics of my disappearance, the way I would move my own life out of their orbit with the same precision I used to move shipping containers across the Atlantic. Family isn't the people who scream at nurses on your behalf while ignoring your actual existence. Family is the people who see you when you are standing right in front of them, not just when they need you to hold their bags. I am Audrey Sterling, and I am done being the background noise to a story that never had a role for me to begin with. The silence I would give them from this moment forward would be more expensive than any lawsuit my mother could threaten, and more permanent than any medical license she thought she could shred. It was time to stop being a Sterling and start being the woman I had spent $12 million worth of effort becoming. Growing up in the shadow of a $3.2 million brownstone in the historic heart of Beacon Hill, the contrast between my existence and my sister's was more than just a family dynamic. It was clinical, a surgical dissection of worth performed daily by my parents. My name is Audrey Sterling, and while the world saw a family of prestige living behind a polished black lacquer door with brass knockers, the reality inside those walls was a study in profound inequality. I spent my formative years navigating the steep cobblestone streets of Boston in $40 off-brand loafers that pinched my heels until they bled, a stark and humiliating contrast to the lifestyle my parents curated for my younger sister, Chloe. Now, 24 and perpetually swaddled in the unearned luxury of our father's guilt, Chloe was the undisputed golden child of the Sterling household, a title she wore with the same casual arrogance as the $9,200 Cartier love bracelet that circled her wrist. That bracelet, a gleaming circle of 18-karat yellow gold set with 4 brilliant-cut diamonds, was a gift for simply graduating from a liberal arts college with a GPA that wouldn't have cleared the hurdle for a state school, while I was buried under the suffocating weight of an $84,000 student loan debt that I carried like a physical burden every single day of my life. The financial disparity was not a matter of necessity, but a deliberate choice made by my father, Marcus, who viewed my independence as an affront and Chloe's helplessness as a virtue. While I was pulling 80-hour weeks at the logistics firm, surviving on lukewarm black coffee from the break room and $5 prepackaged salads to earn my promotion to vice president, Chloe lived on a $5,500 monthly allowance that hit her Chase Sapphire account like clockwork on the first of every month. I remember the sound of my own exhaustion, the low hum of the office lights at 3 a.m. as I cross-referenced shipping manifests and fuel surcharges for our European accounts, knowing that every cent I earned was a brick in the wall of my freedom. Meanwhile, Chloe's biggest struggle was deciding which influencer-approved cafe to visit for a $20 avocado toast. The most infuriating aspect of our relationship, however, was not the money, but the timing of her suffering. It became a predictable, agonizing cycle. Every time I achieved a milestone, whether it was closing a $2.1 million contract or finally seeing my credit score hit 800, Chloe would suddenly develop a suite of vague, undiagnosed illnesses that sent my mother into a spiral of hysterical caregiving. If I received a commendation from the board, Chloe would wake up with a mysterious neurological fatigue that required her to spend the day in a darkened room with silk sleep masks and organic lavender oil. If I was featured in a trade magazine for my work in supply chain optimization, she would claim her aura was misaligned, prompting her to spend $1,200 on a set of spiritual healing crystals sourced from a boutique in Sedona that promised to cleanse her of the very stress she was inflicting on everyone else. I watched her arrange those rocks, amethyst, citrine, and smoky quartz, on her nightstand with a reverence she never showed to the people working to support her, while I was literally counting my pennies to see if I could afford the high-speed rail ticket to visit a client in New York without dipping into my emergency savings. My parents never questioned her. They never asked why her migraines only appeared on the days I had something to celebrate. Instead, they would look at me with silent, judgmental eyes, as if my success was a direct assault on Chloe's fragile well-being, as if my strength was the reason for her weakness. The Beacon Hill brownstone, with its original crown molding and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Boston Common, felt less like a home and more like a stage where I was the uncredited stagehand and Chloe was the prima donna. I remember sitting at the mahogany dining table for Sunday dinner, a tradition my mother insisted upon despite the palpable tension, watching Chloe complain about the texture of the organic, wild-caught salmon while I calculated the interest accruing on my loans. The scent of expensive beeswax candles and Joe Malone pomegranate noir room spray filled the air, a fragrance that to this day makes my stomach knot with the memory of being told I was too focused on material gain because I dared to ask for a contribution toward my tuition. My father, sipping a glass of 2018 Silver Oak Cabernet that cost more than my weekly grocery budget, would nod sympathetically as Chloe described the heavy energy she felt in her yoga studio. There was no mention of my promotion, no inquiry into the logistics empire I was helping to run, only the soft, clinking sound of silver against china and the suffocating silence that greeted any mention of my life. I worked 3 jobs during my final year of graduate school, tutoring undergrads in macroeconomics for $25 an hour, waitressing at a bistro in Back Bay where the tips were barely enough to cover my T-pass, and doing freelance data entry until my eyes burned and the numbers blurred into a chaotic mess on the screen. I did this while Chloe was off on a self-discovery trip to Bali that cost my father $15,000, a trip she documented on Instagram with captions about finding her truth while staying in a 5-star resort that overlooked the rice terraces of Ubud. The bitterness I felt wasn't about the vacation itself, but the fact that I was punished for my competence. Because I was capable, I was expected to provide for myself. Because Chloe was a professional victim, she was rewarded with a life of leisure. I would come home to my cramped apartment in Alston, where the heat barely worked, and the sound of the Green Line trains rattled my windows every 10 minutes, and I would look at the photos of our childhood in the Beacon Hill house. There I was, 10 years old, wearing hand-me-down sweaters from a cousin, while Chloe, at 4, was dressed in custom-made smocked dresses that cost hundreds of dollars. The pattern was set before we could even speak. My promotion to vice president was the culmination of years of sacrifice, of choosing spreadsheets over sleep and career over comfort. I had navigated the complex world of international shipping, managing a team of 40 people and ensuring that our $12.4 million budget was utilized with surgical precision. I was the one people called when a cargo ship was stuck in the Suez Canal or when a warehouse strike in Rotterdam threatened to paralyze our operations. I was the one who understood the intricacies of customs law and the fluctuating price of maritime fuel. Yet when I finally stood in my parents' living room, beneath the glittering crystal chandelier that my mother had imported from Murano, and told them the news, the reaction was a chilling, hollow silence. My mother didn't even look up from her iPad, where she was researching holistic treatments for chronic malaise for Chloe. My father merely grunted and asked if I could help Chloe move her new meditation bench into her bedroom because his back was bothering him. The realization that I would never be enough for them, no matter how many millions I managed or how many titles I earned, was like a physical blow to the chest. I was the background noise, the reliable machine that kept running while they poured all their emotional and financial capital into the broken child. Chloe's $1,200 crystals sat in a velvet-lined box on the coffee table, a physical manifestation of the waste and the madness that defined our family. I stood there in my tailored suit, the one I had saved for 3 months to buy so I would look the part of a vice president, and felt like a stranger in my own skin. I was Audrey Sterling, a woman of substance and steel, and I was being dismissed in favor of a girl who couldn't even manage her own laundry without a mental breakdown. The injustice of it was a searing heat in my veins, a fire that finally burned away the last remnants of my desire for their approval. I realized then that my worth was not determined by the inhabitants of a $3.2 million brownstone, but by the fact that I had built a life out of nothing but my own sheer will. Family is supposed to be the safety net that catches you. But for me, they were the anchors dragging me down into a sea of resentment and unacknowledged labor. As I walked out of that house, the heavy brass door clicking shut behind me, I knew that the next time I saw them, it would be on my terms, in my world, where hard work and reality actually meant something. I was no longer the decorative statue or the background noise. I was the architect of a future they weren't invited to inhabit. The Sterling name might carry weight in the social registers of Boston, but in the world that mattered, my own name was the only one that held any value. The breaking point of my relationship with the people who shared my DNA occurred on November 14th at precisely 7:42 p.m., a moment frozen in time like a fly in amber under the vaulted gold-leaf ceilings of L'Espalier in Boston's Back Bay. We were seated at a premier corner table, draped in heavy, snow-white Belgian linen that felt like silk beneath my fingertips, gathered to celebrate what I mistakenly believed was a milestone worth acknowledging in the Sterling family record. I had arrived early, my heart hammering a nervous, hopeful rhythm against my ribs, wearing a navy wool coat and the quiet confidence of a woman who had just secured her future. I had just finished explaining the technical complexities of my new role as vice president, detailing the grueling negotiations I had spearheaded to streamline our transatlantic routes, and I finally mentioned the cold, hard number that represented my worth in the corporate world. A new base salary of $215,000, supplemented by a performance-based bonus structure that could easily push me into the mid-six-figure range. The words had barely left my lips, echoing softly against the crystal glassware, when the air in the room seemed to curdled into something thick and toxic. I watched as the light in my father's eyes extinguished, replaced by a cold, calculating jealousy that he masked with a thin veil of boredom. But it was my sister Chloe who provided the theatrical finale to my short-lived moment of triumph. At the exact second, I mentioned the $215,000, a figure that dwarfed the allowance she begged for every month. Chloe's eyes rolled back into her head with a practiced cinematic grace, her body going limp as she slid from her velvet-upholstered chair. She collapsed onto the intricate patterns of the antique Persian rug, her fall strategically choreographed to knock over a $480 bottle of 2015 Cabernet Sauvignon that we had barely begun to drink. The deep, blood-red liquid bloomed across the white linen and splattered onto my beige suede pumps, a violent stain that mirrored the sudden carnage of my family life. My father, Harrison Sterling, didn't even lean down to check if she was breathing. He didn't reach for her pulse or call out her name in genuine fear. Instead, he stood up slowly, his face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated loathing as he turned his gaze toward me. "You and your pathetic, fragile ego did this to her, Audrey. You just couldn't help yourself, could you? You had to brag and flaunt your little paycheck while your sister is clearly suffering from a physical collapse brought on by the stress of your constant competition," he hissed, his voice a low, lethal vibration that drew the attention of the surrounding diners at the neighboring tables. My mother, Victoria, was already on her knees, cradling Chloe's head and wailing about a neurological crisis, her voice rising in a crescendo of artificial panic that filled the sophisticated silence of the restaurant. I stood there, frozen, my mouth still open from the sentence I hadn't finished, watching the two people who were supposed to be my protectors transform me into a villain for the crime of being successful. Harrison didn't offer a hand to help me up, or a word of apology for the accusation. He simply grabbed his charcoal gray wool overcoat and motioned for my mother to gather Chloe, who was already fluttering her eyelashes in a way that suggested her unconsciousness was rapidly evaporating now that the spotlight was firmly back on her. "Get out of my sight, Audrey. I cannot even look at you right now. Your selfishness is a disease that is killing this family," my father said, his words cutting deeper than any corporate rejection I had ever faced in the high-stakes world of logistics. Without another glance in my direction, they hoisted Chloe up between them and swept toward the exit, their movements frantic and loud, leaving a trail of whispers and judgment in their wake as they sped off in their silver 2024 Mercedes-Benz S-Class toward Massachusetts General Hospital. I was left sitting alone at a table set for 4, surrounded by the remnants of a celebration that had turned into a funeral for my childhood delusions. The waiter approached tentatively, his face a mixture of pity and professional detachment, and placed the check on the dampened tablecloth. The total, including the spilled wine and the appetizers we had barely touched, came to $1,142.68, a staggering sum for a meal that had ended in my total excommunication. I pulled my Chase Sapphire Reserve card from my wallet with trembling fingers and paid the bill to the very last cent, adding a 25% tip for the staff who had been forced to witness the Sterling family's latest public meltdown. The walk back to my apartment through the biting November wind was the longest journey of my life, the cold air stinging my cheeks and the salt from my unshed tears burning my eyes. I realized then that my father hadn't been worried about Chloe's health. He had been humiliated by my autonomy, and he had used my sister's manufactured crisis as a weapon to put me back in my place, which in his mind was beneath his heel. Every time I reached for the sun, they pulled the clouds over me, and this time, the darkness felt permanent. I sat on the floor of my darkened living room that night, still wearing the stained shoes, and looked at the digital clock on my microwave as it flickered to 10 p.m. I knew that at the hospital they were likely in a private suite, with my father demanding the attention of every specialist on call while Chloe basked in the glow of their undivided concern. The cost of that dinner was $1,142, but the true price was the realization that I was an orphan with living parents, a woman who had spent 30 years trying to buy a seat at a table where she was never truly welcome. I thought about the logistics of it all, the way my father could spend thousands on a car or a bottle of wine, but begrudged me the simple acknowledgement of a job well done. I thought about the $5,500 he funneled into Chloe's account every month to keep her dependent and docile, contrasted against the $84,000 in student loans I had painstakingly clawed my way out of. The injustice was a physical weight in the room, heavier than the mahogany furniture or the high-rise walls. I wasn't just managing shipping containers and global supply chains anymore. I was managing the fallout of a lifetime of emotional neglect. My name is Audrey Sterling, and as I watched the city lights of Boston shimmer through the glass of my window, I made a silent vow that the $1,142 I spent at L'Espalier would be the last cent I ever contributed to the theater of their lives. If I was a decorative statue to them, then I would become a statue of salt, looking back at the ruins of our relationship one last time before turning away forever. The silence of my apartment, which used to feel lonely, suddenly felt like a sanctuary, a space where no one could roll their eyes at my promotions or blame me for their self-inflicted tragedies. I picked up my phone and saw a text from my mother, sent at 11:15 p.m. "Chloe is in the ICU for observation. No thanks to you, don't bother calling." I didn't reply. I didn't even feel the urge to defend myself. I simply deleted the thread and blocked their numbers, the digital equivalent of slamming that heavy black lacquer door in Beacon Hill. My father had told me to get out of his sight, and I intended to grant him that wish with a permanence that he couldn't possibly comprehend. I am a vice president, a woman of industry, and a survivor of a $3.2 million house of horrors, and I would no longer allow my life to be the background noise to Chloe's crystalline delusions. Family isn't the people who leave you with the bill for your own heartbreak. Family is the bridge you build for yourself when the people who raised you try to burn it down. I sat in the stillness, the red wine stain on my shoes drying into a dark, permanent shadow, and for the first time in 30 years, I breathed air that didn't feel like it belonged to Marcus and Victoria Sterling. It was my air, paid for by my work, in a life that was finally, irrevocably, mine alone. The moral of the Sterling story was simple. You can buy the best wine in the world and the most expensive gold bracelets, but you can't buy the dignity of a daughter who has finally realized she is worth more than the silence you gave her. I closed my eyes and let the reality sink in. The bill was paid, the table was cleared, and the show was finally over. I sat in the driver's seat of my 2019 lunar silver metallic Honda Civic, the engine idling roughly in the desolate, wind-swept corner of the Massachusetts General Hospital parking lot at exactly 11:14 p.m. The heater was struggling against the biting Boston frost, emitting a faint metallic clicking sound as it blew air that was merely lukewarm against my frozen knuckles. My name is Audrey Sterling, and while my family's silver Mercedes S-Class was likely parked in a heated, reserved VIP bay near the entrance, I was tucked away in the shadows of the overflow lot, surrounded by the hum of the city and the crushing weight of a revelation 30 years in the making. The dashboard clock flickered with a dim, amber glow, casting long shadows across the yellow legal pad I had pulled from my briefcase, the same pad I used to calculate multi-million-dollar logistics contracts and international shipping tariffs. With a hand that had finally stopped trembling, I uncapped my black Uniball Onyx pen and drew a single, uncompromising vertical line down the center of the page, a border between the life I had endured and the one I was about to claim. On the left side of the paper, under the heading Family Input, I began to list the financial and emotional contributions Marcus and Victoria Sterling had made to my existence since I turned 18. I noted the $0 contributed to my undergraduate degree at the University of Chicago, the $0 provided for my MBA, and the $0 offered when my first apartment was flooded during a winter storm. Under this column, the grand total was written in bold, stark numbers, $0. Then, I moved my pen to the right side of the line under the heading Emotional Cost, and the words poured out of me like a physical purge. I wrote about the thousands of hours spent as Chloe's unpaid emotional punching bag, the dozens of celebrations I had missed to attend her fabricated medical emergencies, and the systematic erosion of my self-worth by a father who viewed my success as a threat to his dominance. For emotional cost, I didn't write a number. I simply wrote the word infinite in large, jagged letters that nearly tore through the thin yellow paper. I realized in that freezing car, as the condensation from my breath clouded the windows, that for 3 decades I had been paying a loyalty tax to people who wouldn't even buy me a $5 cup of coffee if they saw me shivering on a street corner. The tears that had been blurring my vision suddenly dried, replaced by a cold, surgical clarity that felt like the onset of a winter frost. I looked at the hospital's glowing red emergency sign in the distance, knowing that inside those walls, my mother was likely berating a resident while Chloe reclined on high thread count sheets, enjoying the fruits of her latest performance. They were waiting for me to come crawling back, waiting for me to apologize for my promotion, for my $215,000 salary, and for the audacity of having a life that didn't revolve around their whims. They expected me to be the one to bridge the gap, to pay the next installment of the loyalty tax with my dignity. But as the clock turned to 11:20 p.m., I felt the last cord of filial obligation snap with the precision of a guillotine. I reached into the center console and retrieved my iPhone 15 Pro, the screen illuminating my face with a harsh, clinical light that revealed the exhaustion and the new, iron-hard resolve in my eyes. I opened my encrypted messaging app and found the contact for my fiancé, Dr. Julian Vance, a man who had seen the bruises on my soul long before I was willing to admit they existed. Julian was a chief resident of cardiology at a rival hospital, a man who understood the value of time, the weight of responsibility, and the absolute necessity of boundaries. For months, he had been quietly preparing a safety net for me, a strategic exit plan that we had discussed in hushed tones during our rare, quiet dinners at our favorite hole-in-the-wall bistro in the North End. He knew every detail of the $1,142 dinner bill I had just paid, and he knew that my father's hissed command for me to get out of his sight was the final signature on our severance agreement. With a steady thumb, I typed a single one-word text message that would set in motion a chain of events I had spent years dreaming about, but only seconds finally deciding upon. The word was execute. There were no explanations needed, no emotional pleas, and no second-guessing. That one word was the command to initiate the legal and financial separation that would untether my life from the Sterling estate forever. I hit send and watched the little blue bubble vanish into the digital ether, feeling a profound sense of lightness that felt almost like levity. The silence in the Honda Civic was no longer oppressive. It was the silence of a clean slate. I looked down at my yellow legal pad one last time, seeing the infinite cost I had paid, and I realized that my debt was settled. I had paid in full with my childhood, my holidays, and my peace of mind. As I turned the key in the ignition, the engine roared to life with a defiant growl, and I shifted the car into gear, steering away from the hospital and toward the high-rise condo that I owned, the one my parents had never seen because they couldn't stand the idea of me standing on my own 2 feet. I was Audrey Sterling, a woman who managed $12 million of global commerce, and I had just completed the most important transaction of my life. I had bought back my soul from a family of bankrupt narcissists. The loyalty tax was abolished, the accounts were closed, and as I drove under the orange glow of the streetlights on Storrow Drive, I knew that the next time my father saw me, it wouldn't be as his decorative statue, but as a storm he was entirely unprepared to weather. The technicality of my departure was as meticulous as any logistics manifest I had ever designed. Julian had already secured the signatures of the 3 top-tier private investigators we had retained to look into my father's offshore consulting fees, accounts that I suspect had been funding Chloe's lifestyle while evading the very taxes my father claimed were beneath him. By sending that text, I wasn't just walking away, I was engaging a full-scale tactical withdrawal that would leave the sterling reputation in the very ruins they had tried to make of my life. I felt the leather of the steering wheel beneath my palms and realized I didn't need the heated seats of a Mercedes to feel warm. The fire of my own indignation was more than enough. The 2019 Honda Civic, with its 42,000 miles and its fading scent of vanilla air freshener, felt like a chariot of gold compared to the suffocating luxury of the Beacon Hill brownstone. I reached over and turned up the radio, the sound of a cello concerto filling the small cabin, a sophisticated and lonely melody that matched the rhythm of my new reality. I thought about the $5,500 allowance my sister received, and I smiled, knowing that within 48 hours, the legal injunctions Julian's team had prepared would begin to freeze the secondary trust accounts that fueled her parasitic existence. My father wanted me out of his sight, and I was going to ensure that he lived the rest of his life looking for the daughter he had discarded, only to find a wall of legal documentation and professional silence. The moral of this story is that family isn't a blood type or a shared last name. Family is a contract of mutual respect, and when one party breaches that contract repeatedly for 30 years, the only logical move is to terminate the agreement. I am Audrey Sterling, and my worth is no longer a matter of debate in a hospital waiting room or at a restaurant table covered in spilled wine. My worth is the $215,000 salary I earned, the $84,000 in debt I erased, and the one-word command that finally set me free. The execute command wasn't just for Julian, it was for me, a signal to finally live the life I had worked so hard to build in the shadows. As I pulled into my parking garage and the heavy iron gate slid shut behind me, I knew that the Sterling name might still be etched in stone on Beacon Hill. But the person who made that name mean something was finally home. The precision of a logistical operation is built on the foundation of timing and undeniable data, and as I stepped through the sliding glass doors of the Phillips House, the ultra-exclusive VIP wing of Massachusetts General Hospital, at exactly 12:03 a.m., I felt the cold, sharp clarity of a woman who had just completed the most successful audit of her life. The atmosphere in this wing was a jarring juxtaposition of clinical sterility and high society opulence, where the air smelled not just of the sharp, chemical tang of industrial-grade bleach, but also of the heavy, floral notes of Creed Silver Mountain Water perfume, a scent my mother had used for decades as an olfactory weapon of class dominance. My fiancé, Dr. Julian Vance, was far more than just a dedicated physician. He was the head of trauma at this very institution, a man who commanded a salary of $410,000 a year and moved through these halls with a quiet, lethal authority that my father, despite his millions, could never truly possess. Julian was waiting for me near the nursing station, his scrubs crisp and his expression unreadable to anyone but me. But as our eyes met, I saw the signal. The stage was set, and the evidence I held in my hand was the final nail in the coffin of the Sterling family's charade. I clutched a heavy manila folder against my chest, the weight of the paper feeling more substantial than any diamond or designer bag I had ever been forced to carry for my mother. Inside this folder was the fruit of a 14-minute operation facilitated by my network in the city's security sector. I had obtained the high-definition CCTV footage from L'Espalier, captured by a Hikvision 4K dome camera, which showed the entire sequence of Chloe's collapse from 3 different angles. But the most damning piece of evidence was the digital trail she had left behind in her arrogance. I had the printed credit card statements from Chloe's secondary Chase Sapphire account for the last 48 hours, revealing a series of curious purchases made at a specialty costume shop in the North End. $45 for professional-grade theatrical makeup, a bottle of stage-quality fake blood, and a set of pallor-enhancing setting powders. As I rounded the corner into the private waiting area, I saw them, Marcus and Victoria Sterling, looking like two predatory birds as they harassed a terrified first-year surgical resident who couldn't have been older than 26. My father was towering over the young man, his $3,000 Hugo Boss suit jacket discarded over a chair, while my mother poked her manicured finger toward the resident's chest, demanding to know why a world-class neurologist hadn't been flown in from the Mayo Clinic yet. They didn't see me at first, so I stood there for a moment, absorbing the sheer, calculated cruelty of their performance. My sister Chloe was tucked away in a private room behind them, presumably unconscious or fighting for her life on a $5,500 a night hospital bed, while my parents used her manufactured crisis to exert the only thing they valued: power. When my father finally turned and saw me, his face twisted into a sneer that looked like a scar. "I told you to stay out of my sight, Audrey. Have you come back to gloat while your sister lies in a coma because of your greed?" he barked, his voice echoing off the polished marble floors and causing a passing nurse to flinch. My mother didn't even speak. She just let out a sharp theatrical sob and buried her face in a pashmina scarf that cost more than the resident's monthly rent. I didn't flinch, and I didn't apologize. Instead, I walked to the center of the room and placed the manila folder on the mahogany side table with a sound that was as final as a gavel. "I didn't come here to gloat, Dad. I came here to settle the bill," I said, my voice coming out as a low, steady hum of pure, unadulterated coldness. I opened the folder and fanned out the credit card statements like a deck of cards, ensuring the line item for theatrical effects and makeup incorporated was highlighted in bright fluorescent yellow. I watched as my father's eyes darted down to the paper, his brow furrowing as he processed the $45 charge and the timestamp from yesterday afternoon at 3:14 p.m. Beside it, I placed the printed stills from the CCTV footage, specifically the one where Chloe could be seen adjusting her position on the Persian rug to ensure she didn't hit her head on the table leg before the wine bottle was tipped over. The silence that followed was heavy, thick, and suffocating. My mother's artificial sobbing stopped instantly, her eyes snapping open with a predatory sharpness as she looked at the evidence of her favorite daughter's betrayal of their own narrative. Julian stepped forward then, his presence filling the room with a professional weight that my father's money couldn't buy. "As the head of trauma, I've taken the liberty of reviewing Chloe's charts," Julian said, his voice as smooth and cold as a scalpel. "Her blood work is perfect, her vitals are better than mine, and the only thing abnormal about her neurological state is a slight irritation from what appears to be stage makeup on her temples. There will be no Mayo Clinic, and there will be no shredded licenses tonight, Marcus." The shift in the room was tectonic. My father looked from Julian back to the folder, his face turning a shade of gray that matched his expensive suit. He had spent 30 years using Chloe's frailty as a leash to keep me in line, a way to ensure I never felt superior despite my undeniable success. Now, that leash was severed, and the person holding the knife was the daughter he had dismissed as a decorative statue. "You think this changes anything? You think because she's a little dramatic that your behavior at dinner is excused?" my mother hissed, trying to pivot the blame back to me with the practiced ease of a career narcissist. But I was done playing the game. I looked at her, seeing the desperation behind the Botox and the expensive jewelry, and I felt a profound sense of pity that was even colder than my anger. "It changes everything, Mother, because I am no longer paying the tax on your lies," I replied, picking up the folder and tucking it back under my arm. I then reached into my pocket and pulled out a small metallic object, the key to the Beacon Hill brownstone that I had carried since I was 16. I dropped it into the glass of water my father was holding, the splash small but symbolic. The sound of the key hitting the bottom of the glass was the only noise in the room for a long beat. I realized then that my father, the great Harrison Sterling, was nothing more than a small man in a large suit, terrified of a world where he couldn't control the narrative. He looked at the key, then at me, and I saw the first flicker of genuine fear in his eyes. The fear of a man who realized his most valuable asset had just walked off the balance sheet. Julian placed a hand on the small of my back, a gesture of solidarity and protection that I had never once received from the man standing in front of me. "We're leaving now," I said, my voice echoing with a finality that needed no further explanation. "From this moment on, any communication regarding family matters will go through Julian's legal team or my firm's attorneys. Do not call my office, do not come to my condo, and do not expect me to carry your bags ever again." My father tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish, but the words were gone. He had nothing left to say, because for the first time in 30 years, I wasn't listening for his approval. We walked out of the VIP wing, leaving the scent of bleach and perfume behind us. As we passed the nursing station, I saw the resident I had seen earlier. He looked up, and I gave him a small, knowing nod, a silent apology for the family he had been forced to endure. The $12.4 million budget I managed at work felt like a simple arithmetic problem compared to the emotional accounting I had just finalized. I was Audrey Sterling, and I was 30 years old, and I had just walked out of a $3.2 million house of cards into the cold, honest air of a Boston midnight. My sister was in a room somewhere behind me, probably washing fake blood off her face in a $500 an hour bathroom, while my parents sat in the wreckage of their own making. The loyalty tax was a debt I would never pay again. As I reached the parking lot and looked at my 2019 Honda Civic, it didn't look like a compromise anymore. It looked like a getaway car. Family isn't the people who stage medical emergencies to hide your light. Family is the person who stands in the hospital hall with a folder full of truth and a hand on your back. Julian opened the door for me, and as I sat down, I felt the warmth of the heater finally kicking in, a real, tangible heat that didn't require anyone's permission to exist. The moral of the Sterling legacy was that gold is only valuable if it isn't used to chain the people you love, and tonight, I had finally broken the links. I looked at the hospital one last time, the red emergency sign fading in the rearview mirror, and I realized that for the first time in my life, there was no crisis left to manage but my own happiness. The showdown that would finally dismantle the carefully constructed theater of the Sterling family occurred in room 412 of the Phillips house, a private suite that cost $2,400 a day and looked more like a five-star hotel room than a medical facility. As I pushed open the heavy, soundproofed oak doors, I was met with the cloying scent of dozens of white lilies, Chloe's favorite flower, and the low, rehearsed murmur of 12 of my parents' closest socialite friends, the elite of Beacon Hill and the Lake Forest set, who had been summoned like a Greek chorus to witness my supposed cruelty. My sister Chloe lay draped against a mountain of high-thread-count Egyptian cotton pillows, wearing a $200 silk hospital gown she had likely ordered from an upscale boutique specifically for this performance, her skin artificially pale under the dim, recessed lighting. She was hooked up to a state-of-the-art Nihon Koden heart monitor, but the digital readout was a damning piece of evidence in itself, showing a rhythm that was suspiciously steady at a perfect 68 beats per minute, the resting heart rate of a woman who was neither in pain nor in danger. My mother, Victoria, was positioned at the bedside like a tragic martyr, clutching a hand-embroidered silk handkerchief to her eyes and sobbing softly to the gathered crowd about Chloe's fragile heart and the unbearable stress of family betrayal. I walked into the center of that room wearing my $1,500 charcoal gray Theory power suit, my heels clicking against the polished hardwood floor with the precision of a ticking clock. I didn't look like a grieving sister, and I certainly didn't look like the decorative statue they had tried to mold me into. I looked like a federal auditor who had arrived to collect a debt that was 30 years overdue. My father, Marcus, stood by the window, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression hardening as he saw me enter with the manila folder still tucked firmly under my arm. The room fell silent, the socialites clutching their Chanel handbags and adjusting their pearls as they prepared to watch the execution of my reputation. My mother looked up, her eyes flashing with a predatory gleam through the artificial tears, and she pointed a trembling finger at me. "How dare you show your face here after what you did to her?" she wailed, her voice rising so that every influential ear in the room could hear the indictment. "You stood there and bragged about your money while your sister's heart was failing. You are a monster, Audrey, a cold-blooded monster who cares more for a paycheck than for her own flesh and blood." I didn't break my stride until I was standing at the foot of Chloe's bed, looking down at the girl who had spent her entire life using her perceived weakness as a weapon of mass destruction. I could see the faint line of the theatrical makeup I had identified earlier. A subtle gray shadow blended into her jawline to simulate the look of physical exhaustion, a detail that was as pathetic as it was meticulous. The 12 witnesses leaned in, their faces a mask of manufactured sympathy and whispered judgment, ready to carry the story of my betrayal back to every country club and charity board in the city. But they didn't know that the woman standing before them was no longer playing the role of the silent observer. I reached into my folder and pulled out the high-resolution stills from the restaurant's security footage, laying them out on the rolling overbed table right next to Chloe's designer water bottle. "I want everyone to take a very close look at these images," I said, my voice projecting with the same authority I used when addressing the board of directors at my firm. "Because what you are witnessing in this room isn't a medical crisis. It is a meticulously choreographed production designed to protect a lie and punish the only person in this family who actually works for a living." I pointed to the timestamp on the first image, which showed Chloe at the restaurant, perfectly healthy and checking her reflection in a butter knife just seconds before her supposed collapse. Then I moved to the second image, where the camera caught her strategically tipping the $480 bottle of Cabernet so that it wouldn't ruin her own dress but would thoroughly soak mine. My father stepped forward, his face a violent shade of red that matched the wine in the photo. "Audrey, that is enough. You are delusional and you are embarrassing yourself in front of our friends," he hissed, his voice low and dangerous. But I ignored him, turning my attention to the socialites who were now whispering among themselves, their curiosity finally outweighing their loyalty to my mother's narrative. "I also have the credit card statements for the professional-grade stage makeup and fake blood purchased yesterday afternoon," I continued, tossing the highlighted documents onto the bedspread. "Chloe didn't have a heart attack. She had a rehearsal, and the only thing fragile in this room is the ego of a man who can't stand the fact that his eldest daughter is worth more on paper than he is in character." Chloe's eyes snapped open then, the coma vanishing in an instant as she realized the script had been flipped. She sat up, her face flushing with a very real, very untheatrical rage. "You bitch! You've always been jealous of me," she spat, her voice shrill and devoid of any neurological fatigue. The heart monitor skipped a beat, jumping to 95 as her adrenaline spiked, providing the only honest data point of the entire night. I watched as the faces of the 12 socialites shifted from pity to profound discomfort. They were seeing the Sterling family without its polish, the raw, ugly machinery of our dysfunction exposed under the harsh light of the truth. My mother tried to snatch the papers from the table, but I held them down. "No, Mother. Let them see it. Let them see exactly how much effort you put into making sure I felt like a burden while Chloe was rewarded for being a fraud. The cost of this room is $2,400 a day, and the cost of the specialists you've demanded will run into the tens of thousands, all for a girl who just didn't want to hear that her sister got a promotion." The silence that followed was different this time. It wasn't the silence of my exclusion, but the silence of their exposure. One by one, the friends began to edge toward the door, murmuring excuses about the late hour and the need to get home to their own estates. They didn't want to be part of a vigil anymore. They wanted to get away from the stench of a scandal they couldn't spin. My father stood paralyzed, his hands trembling as he realized that the audience he had curated to humiliate me was now the very audience that would spread the truth of his daughter's deceit across the city. He looked at me, and for a split second, I saw the man behind the $3,000 suit, a man who was fundamentally bankrupt of any real substance, a man who had traded his relationship with his firstborn for the comfort of a lie. "I am Audrey Sterling," I said, leaning in so that only my family could hear me, "and this is the last time you will ever use me as a prop in your theater of the absurd. The loyalty tax is settled, and the account is closed." I turned on my heel and walked out of room 412, leaving the manila folder and the scattered lies behind me. As I stepped back into the hallway, Julian was there, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, a small, proud smile playing on his lips. He didn't need to ask how it went. The sight of 12 prominent Bostonians scurrying toward the elevators told him everything he needed to know. We walked together toward the exit, our footsteps echoing in a perfect, synchronized rhythm. Behind me, I could hear the faint sound of my mother starting a new argument with the nurses, but the words no longer had any power over me. They were just noise, the fading echoes of a life I had finally outgrown. The moral of this showdown wasn't just about exposing Chloe's fake blood or my father's fake concern. It was about the realization that when you stop playing your assigned role in someone else's drama, the entire play falls apart. I was 30 years old, I was a vice president, and I was finally, truly free. As we reached the parking lot and the cool night air hit my face, I realized that I didn't need a silk gown or a VIP suite to feel important. I had my own name, my own career, and a man who loved me for the strength my parents had tried so hard to break. The Sterling name might belong to them, but the future belonged to me, and it was a future where I would never again have to prove my heart was beating. I am Audrey Sterling, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't the background noise, I was the entire symphony. The atmosphere in room 412 was thick with the scent of lilies and the suffocating perfume of 12 socialites who had gathered to witness the fall of the elder Sterling daughter. But the moment Julian Vance stepped through the door, the air pressure in the room seemed to plummet. Julian, the head of trauma, and a man who managed a $410,000 annual salary with more grace than my father managed his morning coffee, walked in clutching a cold, stainless steel clipboard that glinted under the clinical LED lights. His voice, when he finally spoke, was as cold and unrelenting as a morgue slab in the basement of the hospital, carrying a weight of professional authority that silenced even my mother's practiced hysterics. "The tests are in," he said, and the silence that followed was so profound that I could actually hear the rhythmic, mechanical ticking of a nurse's Casio watch standing by the door, a sharp contrast to the silent, digital world we usually inhabited. My mother, Victoria, let out a piercing, high-pitched wail that was intended for the benefit of the gathered audience, clutching her silk handkerchief to her throat as she leaned over Chloe's supposedly lifeless form. "Is it a coma? Is my baby in a coma because of the stress her sister put her through?" she cried, her eyes darting toward the socialites to ensure they were capturing every second of her manufactured grief. Julian didn't even blink at her performance. Instead, he looked at his Omega Seamaster watch with a detached, surgical precision before turning his gaze back to the medical charts. "Actually, according to the comprehensive toxicology report we just pulled from the lab and the electroencephalogram readings currently streaming from those monitors, Chloe is not in a coma, nor is she in any form of medical distress," Julian stated, his voice echoing off the high-end wallpaper of the VIP suite. He paused for a beat, letting the weight of his words sink into the room before delivering the final blow. "Chloe is currently experiencing a 100% healthy sleep cycle induced by nothing more than 2 over-the-counter melatonin gummies that she clearly self-administered shortly after arriving in the ER." The shock that rippled through the room was almost physical, a collective gasp from the 12 socialites who had spent the last hour whispering about my cruelty. I chose that exact moment to open the manila folder I had been holding, the sound of the metal clasp clicking open sounding like a gunshot in the stillness of the room. I stepped forward, the heels of my $1,500 charcoal gray suit clicking with a lethal rhythm as I moved toward my father, who was standing by the bedside like a crumbling monument to a forgotten era. And according to these verified Chase Sapphire bank records and the digital receipts I've obtained from Theatrical Effects and Makeup Inc. in the North End, Chloe purchased 5 ounces of emergency prop blood and a professional-grade contouring kit at precisely 4:15 p.m. today, I said, my voice as steady and cold as the logistics spreadsheets I managed for a living. I pulled out the printed screenshots I had acquired, clear, high-definition images from the interior of the ambulance that had transported her to the hospital. These images didn't show a dying girl. They showed Chloe sitting up on the gurney, looking directly into the security camera with a triumphant, malicious wink, her face smeared with the very fake blood she had bought just 3 hours earlier. I handed the prints to my father, Harrison Sterling, and watched as the reality of his own daughter's fraud finally breached the fortress of his denial. His hands, which had once signed million-dollar checks and pointed accusatory fingers at me for 30 years, began to shake with a violent, uncontrollable tremor. As his fingers lost their grip, his $14,000 Rolex Submariner, a piece of jewelry he valued more than my entire education, slipped from his wrist and hit the hardwood floor with a heavy, metallic thud that seemed to vibrate through the soles of my shoes. He didn't even look down at the shattered watch. His eyes were glued to the image of Chloe winking at the camera, a visual confirmation that the golden child he had subsidized and protected was nothing more than a cheap actress in a high-stakes play. The socialites in the room began to shift, their faces turning from sympathy for my parents to a mixture of embarrassment and disgust as they realized they had been recruited as extras in a fraudulent tragedy. My mother's sobbing stopped instantly, replaced by a stony, terrifying silence as she realized the narrative had been permanently hijacked by the truth. I looked at my sister, who was still pretending to sleep under the influence of her gummies, and felt a profound sense of relief that had nothing to do with victory and everything to do with closure. The $12 million budget I managed at the firm was a drop in the bucket compared to the emotional debt that had just been canceled in this room. My name is Audrey Sterling, and as I stood in the wreckage of my family's reputation, I realized that the loyalty tax I had been paying for 3 decades had finally been audited and found to be a complete and total scam. I didn't need their approval, I didn't need their money, and I certainly didn't need their drama to define my worth as a woman or a professional. The silence in room 412 was no longer the silence of my exclusion. It was the silence of a house of cards that had finally met a gale force wind. My father looked up at me, his eyes hollow and defeated, but I didn't offer him a hand or a word of comfort. I simply turned back to Julian, who was waiting for me with the same steady, unwavering support he had shown since the moment we met. The technicality of the betrayal was what hurt them the most. The fact that I had used their own tools, money, records, and surveillance to dismantle their lies. I had spent years being told I was the background noise, the decorative statue, the one who didn't understand the complexities of the Sterling legacy. But as I watched the socialites file out of the room without saying a word to my mother, I realized I understood the legacy better than any of them. It was a legacy of smoke and mirrors, of fake blood and melatonin-induced comas. I reached down and picked up the manila folder, tucking it under my arm one last time, a gesture of finality that felt like the closing of a multi-million-dollar merger. "We're done here," I said, not just to the room, but to the 30 years of psychological warfare I had endured. Julian took my hand, his grip warm and solid, and we walked out of the VIP wing together, leaving the broken Rolex and the shattered illusions on the floor of room 412. As we descended in the elevator, the quiet hum of the machinery felt like a transition between worlds. I was leaving behind the Beacon Hill brownstone, the $3.2 million lies, and the $5,500 allowances. I was walking into a life that was earned, not gifted, and built on a foundation of truth rather than theatrical makeup. The moral of the Sterling story was finally clear. You can buy the best heart monitors and the most expensive hospital suites in the world, but you cannot buy a heartbeat that isn't there. My heart was beating at a steady, healthy pace, not because of a gummy or a script, but because I had finally found the courage to stop being a character in someone else's nightmare. I am Audrey Sterling, and as the elevator doors opened to the lobby, I realized that the cold night air wasn't a threat. It was the first breath of my real life. The bill for the drama had been served, the evidence had been presented, and for the first time in my existence, the account was settled in full. I didn't look back at the hospital. I looked forward at the city lights, knowing that the woman who walked out of those doors was someone my parents would never truly know, and that was the greatest promotion of all. The fallout from that night in room 412 was not a slow burn. It was a surgical strike that dismantled the sterling reputation with the cold, mechanical efficiency of a controlled demolition. By exactly 9 a.m. the following morning, the carefully curated elite status that my parents, Marcus and Victoria, had spent 3 decades building in the high society circles of Beacon Hill and the exclusive charity boards of Boston had evaporated like mist in a gale. The 12 socialites who had witnessed the exposure of Chloe's theatrical makeup and the $14,000 Rolex hitting the floor did not keep the secret. They traded it like currency over brunch at the Somerset Club and across the tennis courts of Brookline. The story of the Sterling golden child and her fake blood, her melatonin-induced coma, and the systematic psychological abuse of the daughter who actually managed a $12.4 million logistics budget became the primary topic of conversation among the very people my parents lived to impress. Within 48 hours, my mother's name was quietly removed from the gala planning committee of the Museum of Fine Arts, and my father found his usual table at the Grill 23 and bar suddenly unavailable, a social excommunication that hit them harder than any legal injunction could have. The financial collapse of the Sterling illusion was just as swift and unforgiving as the social one. Chloe, the sister who had lived on a $5,500 monthly allowance and boasted a $9,200 Cartier love bracelet, found herself abruptly disconnected from the source of her unearned luxury. Once the truth was out, the trust accounts my father had used to subsidize her parasitic lifestyle were scrutinized by my legal team and Julian's advisors, revealing a pattern of mismanagement that forced even my father to tighten the reins. Chloe was forced to trade the high thread count sheets of the Phillips house for a damp 400-square-foot basement studio apartment in an unfashionable corner of Somerville. I heard through a mutual acquaintance that the space has stained gray carpeting, a kitchenette with a leaking faucet that drips with a rhythmic, maddening click, and a single window that looks out onto the dirty tires of parked cars. She no longer spends $1,200 on spiritual healing crystals. She spends her days trying to figure out how to operate a communal laundry machine and how to live on a budget that doesn't include $500 an hour yoga instructors. The Cartier bracelet remains on her wrist, a golden shackle to a past she can no longer afford, a piece of jewelry that looks increasingly ridiculous in a basement where the scent of mildew replaces the aroma of lilies. 3 months after the showdown, Julian and I were married on a crisp, crystalline afternoon at a private estate in the Green Mountains of Vermont, a 120-acre sanctuary where the air tasted of pine needles and cold stone. The wedding was a masterclass in intentionality and peace, a stark contrast to the performative galas of my youth. The total cost was exactly $45,000, a figure I paid in full, in cash, using a portion of the performance bonus I had earned at the logistics firm. Every cent was an investment in my own happiness, from the local organic catering to the small, hand-picked orchestra that played Vivaldi as I walked down an aisle of fallen leaves. There were exactly 0 members of the Sterling family invited to that estate. The iron gates remained closed to Marcus, Victoria, and Chloe, ensuring that the sanctity of our union was never touched by the toxic reach of their narcissism. My father tried to send a letter 2 weeks before the ceremony, a 4-page rambling document written on his expensive personal stationery, attempting to blame the misunderstanding on my lack of family loyalty. But I didn't even break the wax seal. I dropped it into the fireplace of my West Loop condo, watching the heavy cream paper turn to gray ash as the scent of smoke filled the room. My life now is defined by a silence that is not empty, but full. A profound, resonant peace that I have built with the same meticulous care I use to manage international cargo routes. My home is a sanctuary where the thermostat is set exactly where I want it, and the only sounds are the hum of the city far below and the gentle breathing of Julian as he sleeps after a long shift at the hospital. I no longer wake up in a cold sweat wondering what crisis Chloe has manufactured or what insult my mother has prepared for the next Sunday dinner. Instead, I fill my space with the quiet luxuries that I earned with my own sweat and intellect. I light $40 diptyque feu de bois candles, the scent of a crackling wood fire grounding me in the reality of my independence. I sit at my desk, looking over the $12.4 million budget for the upcoming fiscal year, and I realize that the most successful logistics project of my career was the relocation of my own soul out of the Sterling orbit and into a life of my own making. I am Audrey Sterling, and while I may have been born into a $3.2 million brownstone filled with lies, I live in a world of truth that no amount of money could ever buy. The moral of this journey is that the loyalty tax is an optional debt, one that we only pay as long as we believe the lie that blood justifies abuse. I have learned that family isn't the people who scream at nurses on your behalf while ignoring your actual heart. Family is the person who stands with you in the wreckage of a hospital room and tells you that you are finally enough. It is the peace of knowing that the $215,000 salary I earn is mine, the $84,000 of debt I cleared was my victory, and the woman I see in the mirror is no longer a decorative statue. My mother still sends the occasional email filled with passive-aggressive comments about how the social fabric of the family is torn, but she is shouting into a void. I have blocked their numbers, restricted their access, and moved my life into a frequency they cannot hear. The Sterling name might carry weight in the dusty registers of Beacon Hill, but in the world of real consequences and genuine love, it is my name, Audrey, that carries the strength. I have reclaimed my narrative, edited out the villains, and written a conclusion that begins with a quiet morning in a home where the truth is the only guest ever invited to the table. Looking back at that $1,142 dinner bill at L'Espalier, I see it now as the best money I ever spent. It was the purchase price of my freedom. I don't regret the charcoal gray suit or the manila folder or the coldness in my voice that night. I regret only the years I spent trying to be small so that Chloe could feel large, and the years I spent being silent so that my father could feel powerful. The transition from background noise to the lead architect of my own destiny was painful, but as I sit here now, watching the sun set over the Boston skyline, I know that the cost of leaving was nothing compared to the cost of staying. I am 30 years old. I am a wife. I am a vice president. And I am a woman who has finally learned that you don't need a golden child's inheritance to be wealthy. You only need the courage to stop paying for other people's sins. My home is quiet. My heart is steady at 68 beats per minute without any melatonin, and the truth has finally set me free from the Sterling legacy once and for all. If there is a moral to be found in the ashes of that $14,000 Rolex, it is that time is the only thing we can never buy back, and I refuse to spend another second of mine on people who only love the version of me they can control. I am finally home, and for the first time in 30 years, the air I breathe is entirely, beautifully my own,